Winter 1928. A silver fog clung to the eaves of a Tudor facade that did not belong to any village, but to a city of palms and petrol and promises. The stone looked like a relic imported from another century and another continent. The gardens smelled faintly of citrus and eucalyptus. Through the leaded glass one could see a long dining table, a row of empty chairs, and a chandelier heavy with crystal. Greystone Mansion sat on 16 acres, 16, of bluff above Beverly Hills that had become a private little world. Inside, 55 rooms, hand-carved oak banisters, a library with 7 chimneys, each designed by a different artist, and an array of spaces that suggested hospitality and power in equal measure. It was magnificent, yes, but that grandeur had a machinery beneath it that hummed and burned and demanded wages and coal and secrets. Boilers warmed floors with pipes that threaded like the veins of the house. A staff of 15 worked in shifts before the sun rose. Ledgers kept a tally of deliveries and debts. Who paid when beauty required constant feeding? Who bore the human cost of making stone appear eternal? Today we will follow letters, ledgers, oral recollections, and legal filings to understand how a Tudor dream in California became, for some, a gilded cage, and for others, a case study in which oil wealth and political scandal met in a narrow corridor. If you appreciate investigations that marry architecture and accountability, like this video, subscribe, and tell us in the comments which estate we should examine next. Let us begin. The approach to Greystone had the choreography of a ceremony. A long drive, screened by mature trees, descended to a forecourt paved with stone. The facade read as a sequence of statements in limestone, each window and buttress a line of punctuation. Beneath the roofline, gargoyles watched a landscape that had been reshaped to make the house visible from the city below. The first scent was citrus from planted groves. A second scent was old varnish from the doorframes. A third was the faint chemical tang of polish used to shine brass that the public rarely touched. The grounds announced their scale in numbers that refused to be modest. 16 acres, 16, 55 rooms, 7 fireplaces designed by different craftsmen, a conservatory, a bowling alley, a billiard room, and a hidden bar in the north wing. Up close, details multiplied. Moss in mortar joints, leaded panes with bubbled glass, ironwork laced with Gothic motifs, carved banisters that still held the amber of previous hands. The house was not only built to be seen, it was built to project permanence. Visitors felt admiration and envy in a single breath. Yet as the camera pulls back, another image emerges. A service wing, service quarters for 15 staff, a laundry, and a basement where machinery hummed in shadow. The facade told a cultivated story of permanence and refinement. Behind it, maintenance schedules. The calendar of upkeep was tighter than the public schedule of appearances. The contrast between what Greystone invited the eye to savor and what it demanded the household to provide was the first of several contradictions that would define its history. Below the decorative surfaces, the house ran like a small industrial operation. Central heating, electricity, water filtration, and a complex plumbing system held the mansion in a delicate equilibrium. Staff quarters occupied 2 floors of the east wing. Men and women worked with precision, maintaining a house that cost over $3 million to build, the most expensive private residence in California at that time. Those ledgers, written in a clerkly hand, reveal monthly columns with entries for coal, domestic accounts, staff wages, and maintenance. The operation required a constant flow of supplies and people. A small fleet of vehicles and drivers kept the estate connected to Beverly Hills below. The pattern suggested that no matter how self-contained a mansion might seem, it was an engine dependent on the economy around it and on the wealth that fueled it. Edward Lawrence Doney was the man whose name for decades would be synonymous with Greystone, the oil tycoon whose fortune shaped the landscape. He had been born in 1856 in a small Wisconsin town, the son of Irish immigrants who had fled the potato famine. He learned early to work with his hands, to prospect, to survive. As a young man, he migrated west, drifting through mining camps in Arizona and New Mexico, working as a mule driver, gold miner, fruit packer. Some accounts suggest darker histories, gunslinging in Laredo, a life shaped by rough edges and harder ambitions. By the early 1890s, he had drifted to Los Angeles, penniless and living in a boarding house. One day he noticed a wagon driver passing with a load of dark, greasy bray, tar in Spanish. He asked where it came from. An empty lot near Westlake Park. Doney took a streetcar to the spot and saw black ooze. Using a sharpened tree trunk as a drill, he and a partner struck oil at 200 feet in April 1893. That strike ignited the Los Angeles oil boom. By the turn of the century, there were 3,000 oil wells in the city. Doney's fortune multiplied. He discovered massive oil deposits in Mexico. By the 1920s, he was one of the richest men in the world. He bought land, built a mansion on Chester Place, donated to Catholic institutions, and sought to cement his legacy. The house, Greystone, was to be a gift to his only son, Edward Doney Jr., known as Ned. To Doney Sr., it was a monument, a talisman against forgetting. He insisted on grandeur that would outlast him, a house that would be read as conquest and as testament. Yet his vision contained contradictions. He loved permanence, but build on scandal. He wanted legacy, but feared exposure. He believed in dynasty, but would see it shattered. These tensions were the seed of later tragedies. His fortune was built not only on oil, but on political connections that would prove both profitable and poisonous. The founding story of Greystone is in equal parts aspiration and ambition, wealth and worry, empire and its costs. The design team reads like a list of deliberate choices. The architect was Gordon Kaufman, an English-born designer who had arrived in California in 1914. He had studied at the London Polytechnic Institute and had established his reputation with Mediterranean revival projects, including Scripps College. He imagined exposed beams, steep roofs, and limestone facades arranged in studied asymmetry. He combined elements of English Gothic and Jacobean styles to create what would become his most famous residential commission. The landscape was formal English gardens, terraces, and fountains. The master craftsmen, whose names are lost to record, set each stone and mixed mortar and carved details. The construction foreman kept schedules and managed crews. Lucy Smith Dehaney, Ned's wife, would later oversee the household. Dr. Ernest Fishbaugh would appear in the narrative as the family physician. District Attorney Buren Fitz would enter the story as the man who closed the case. These names show up in correspondence and on official records. The selection of Kaufman reflected Dehaney Sr.'s desire for legitimacy. He sought an architect with credentials and a language that implied heritage. Their plans called for hand-carved oak, limestone from Indiana, and specialist glass. The contract specified materials and timelines. Construction began in February 1927, and the family moved in by September 1928, though the estate took 3 years to complete. Construction was a spectacle and an industrial operation. Horses and trucks carried stone. Sawdust lifted into the air and smelled of resin and fresh cuts. Workers lived in shifts, drawing on men and women who had moved across counties seeking steady wages. The sensory scene of a working day was a layering of sounds and textures, the hollow ring of mallets on stone, the whisper of saw against timber, the metallic cry of rivets, the smell of lime and mortar, sweat cooled by the canyon breeze. Accidents were not rare, though records remain incomplete. The human cost appears in notations for medical visits and in the careful silence that surrounded injuries. Workers lodged complaints about hours and conditions, and the construction was at once a public spectacle and a private labor drama. The house consumed $3 million and 3 years and the labor of hundreds. It was, upon completion, the largest and most expensive private residence in Southern California. But even as the house rose, another machinery was at work, a machinery of political dealings and federal investigations that would cast a shadow over the family and the estate. Once finished, the operation of Greystone demanded an economy of its own. Heat and light required fuel, which translated into monthly outflows. Feeding a household and hosting visitors meant contracts with local suppliers. The estate maintained 15 live-in staff, each with quarters in the East Wing. Tickets and surviving records show items like heating, electricity, staff wages, and maintenance. There were also entries for taxes, for insurance, and for the legal retainers that would become necessary. An inheritance plan was established, and bookkeeping was meticulous to the extent that one could reconstruct patterns over time. But the family's wealth was not stable. It was entangled with political power and with secrets that would soon unravel. The Great Depression would tighten credit and reduce the value of assets. Changes in tax law would complicate estate planning. And beneath the surface, a scandal was brewing that would engulf the Doheny name and haunt the family for decades. The Teapot Dome scandal, as it would be known, was one of the worst breaches of public trust in American history, and Edward Doheny Sr. was at its center. Tension accumulated in the early 1920s in ways that cannot be reduced to ledgers alone. The scandal began with ambition and backroom deals. In 1921, President Warren Harding's Secretary of the Interior, Albert Fall, convinced the Navy to transfer control of federal oil reserves to the Interior Department. Fall then secretly granted leases to 2 oil magnates, Harry Sinclair for Teapot Dome in Wyoming and Edward Doheny for Elk Hills in California. The leases were granted without competitive bidding. In November 1921, Doheny provided Fall with a $100,000 loan delivered in cash in a black satchel by his son Ned and Ned's secretary Hugh Plunkett. The loan was later revealed to be a bribe. Doheny's company expected to extract 250 million barrels of oil from Elk Hills, worth an estimated $100 million in profit. The scandal broke in 1924 when a Senate investigation led by Thomas Walsh uncovered the payments. Fall had received over $400,000 in bribes. The public was outraged. The investigation would drag on for years, producing trials, convictions, and a stain on the Harding administration that would last for decades. Fall was convicted of accepting a bribe and became the first cabinet member to go to prison. Yet, in a bitter irony, Doheny Sr. was acquitted twice, once of conspiracy and once of bribery, despite Fall's conviction for accepting the very same money. As one newspaper reporter observed, "You can't convict $1 million." The scandal placed enormous pressure on the Doheny family. Edward Doheny Sr.'s reputation was destroyed, though his wealth protected him from prison. His son Ned and Hugh Plunkett, who had delivered the cash, were implicated as bagmen and faced potential prosecution. The stress was unbearable. Hugh Plunkett, once a working-class young man who had met Ned while working at the Smith family gas station, had become Ned's closest friend and confidential secretary. He had overseen the construction of Greystone while Ned was in Washington supporting his father through the trials. Hugh signed checks for hundreds of thousands of dollars, paid contractors, and managed the estate. But as the legal pressure mounted, Hugh began to unravel. He divorced his wife in 1928. He reportedly suffered bouts of mental instability and became addicted to barbiturates. He grew morose, consumed by fear of imprisonment or psychiatric commitment. The family urged him to check into a sanitarium. Hugh refused. He faced a choice between two forms of captivity: the mental hospital, where the Dohenis could control the length of his stay, or prison if he testified against them. The predicament was untenable. On the afternoon of February 16, 1929, Ned, Lucy, and Dr. Fishbaugh confronted Hugh at Greystone, urging him to seek help. Hugh refused. That evening, Ned and Lucy visited Hugh at his apartment, and Ned allegedly made impulsive remarks that upset him. What happened next would become one of the most enduring mysteries in Los Angeles history. Around the 35% mark of our narrative, a moment is reserved for direct engagement with you. If this story of stone and scandal resonates, if you are surprised by the secrets that lived beneath this magnificent facade, pause and let us know. In the comments, answer with one word: scandal, death, or silence, to indicate which factor you believe shaped Greystone most profoundly. Your responses shape future investigations and help direct what archive we should open next. Now that we have your attention, we return to the chronology and the tragedy that made and haunted this house. On the night of February 16, 1929, Hugh Plunkett let himself into Greystone with his own key. It was around 9:30 p.m. He made his way to a guest bedroom in the East Wing. He used the house switchboard to call Ned, asking if they could talk. Ned came to the room. What happened next remains disputed to this day. The official story, provided mainly by Lucy, is that she heard a gunshot around 11 p.m. She did not call the police. Instead, she called the family doctor, Dr. Ernest Fishbaugh. Together, they approached the East Wing. Outside the bedroom, they allegedly found Hugh holding a gun and looking distressed. Hugh told them not to come closer. He went back into the room and fired a second shot. This was about 20 minutes after the first. Dr. Fishbaugh later claimed Hugh shut the door softly, then recalled him slamming it in rage. Testimony from the staff sounded rehearsed. The police were not called until 3 hours after the first gunshot, around 2 a.m. When investigators arrived, the scene was already compromised. Ned Doheny was found dead on his back in his underwear and silk bathrobe, a gunshot wound in the back of his skull. Hugh Plunkett was found spread eagle on his stomach, a pool of blood beneath his face caused by a wound to his head. An unfinished cigarette was trapped under his fingers. The bodies had been moved. The murder weapon, Ned's own gun, had no fingerprints. The physical evidence did not match the official story. Within hours, District Attorney Buren Fitz, who had campaigned as a reformer but who was also sensitive to the Doheny family's clout, announced that Plunkett had murdered Doheny and then committed suicide. The motive given was that Hugh had been refused a raise or was angry about being pressured to enter a sanitarium. The case was closed within 2 days. Detectives were uneasy. One investigator later wrote that the bodies had been moved and that the evidence was inconsistent. The rapid closure was suspicious. Theories abounded. Some claimed Hugh killed Ned and then himself out of stress over the upcoming trial. Others suggested Ned killed Hugh to silence him and then, realizing what he had done, turned the gun on himself. A third theory, whispered but never proven, was that Lucy discovered the two men in a compromising situation and killed them both in a jealous rage. The fact that both men were buried in Forest Lawn, a secular cemetery, and that Ned was not given a Catholic burial despite the family's deep faith, added weight to the suicide theory. The truth is buried on a high hill at Forest Lawn in Glendale. Hugh's simple grave lies just down the slope from Ned's opulent memorial. What is certain is that the deaths were convenient for the Doheny family. One key witness was now unavailable to testify. The scandal was contained. and the mansion, barely inhabited for 4 months, was already stained by blood and mystery. The legal and procedural aspects of that tragedy are complex but can be outlined in clear terms. The investigation was rushed, the evidence was tampered with, and the conclusion was predetermined. Byron Fitz, who had political ambitions and who depended on the support of powerful families, had little incentive to pursue a thorough inquiry. The Doheny family, with their immense wealth and legal resources, ensured that the case would not drag the family further into scandal. The press cooperated. Within days, the story faded from headlines. The official narrative was that a mentally unstable secretary had killed his employer and then himself. The alternative narratives, that Ned had killed Hugh and then himself, or that Lucy had killed them both, remained in the realm of whispered speculation. The mansion, which had cost over $4 million to build, was now the site of a double homicide and a cover-up. The tragedy ensured that Greystone would never be simply a house. It would be a monument to ambition, scandal, and unanswered questions. There are at least 3 moments of acute tension in Greystone's story that bear close reading. First, there was the delivery of the bribe in 1921, when Ned Doheny and Hugh Plunkett carried $100,000 cash to Albert Fall in a black satchel. For 3 paragraphs, we listen to memory and legal testimony. On that November day, the air was cold and the 2 young men were nervous. They withdrew the cash from Blair and Company, wrapped it in paper, and placed it in the bag. They took it to Fall's apartment at the Wardman Park Hotel in Washington. Fall gave them a receipt for the loan. Years later, that receipt would be central to the trial. The weight of the moment lay in the knowledge that this transaction, however it was characterized, was a turning point. It was the seed of ruin. It bound Ned and Hugh to Fall and to the scandal that would follow. The money was power, and the money was poison. Second, the confrontation at Greystone on the afternoon of February 16, 1929, produced a 2-paragraph scene of intense negotiation. Ned, Lucy, and Dr. Fishbaugh sat with Hugh in one of the grand rooms. They urged him to check into a sanitarium. Hugh was silent, hands clenched, jaw set, shaking at times. He refused. The tension was suffocating. The doctor saw that it was no use to push further and left. The refusal was a decision point. Hugh chose not to disappear into a controlled environment. He chose, perhaps, to confront the situation on his own terms. That decision led to the events of the evening. The weight of the moment lay in choosing between captivity and catastrophe. Third, there was the rapid closure of the case by Byron Fitz. Officials arrived, examined the scene, took statements, and within 2 days declared the matter resolved. There were no prolonged inquiries, no independent investigations, no challenges to the official narrative. The speed of the closure disturbed Hugh's family. His nephew later said, "They never truly allowed an investigation, so we'll never know the true story. Everyone was afraid of the Dohenys, so the things published weren't true. The Dohenys were just so powerful." The closure was not justice. It was expediency. The weight of the moment lay in the realization that power could shape truth, that wealth could silence questions, and that the law could be bent to serve those who could afford to bend it. Names recur in the record and help us trace responsibility and action. Edward Lawrence Doheny Sr. appears as the patriarch who built an empire on oil and scandal. Edward Doheny Jr., known as Ned, was the heir who inherited wealth and pressure. Lucy Smith Doheny was the wife who survived and who carried the story. Hugh Plunkett was the friend and secretary whose fate was entwined with Ned's. Gordon Kaufman was the architect who designed the mansion. Dr. Ernest Fishbaugh was the family physician who testified. District Attorney Byron Fitz was the official who closed the case. Albert Fall was the corrupt Interior Secretary who took the bribe. These 8 voices appear in letters, transcripts, and legal filings and provide the human lattice of decisions. As the scandal unfolded and the tragedy occurred, adaptation became a painful necessity. Lucy Doheny remained at Greystone with her 5 children. She remarried almost a year to the day after Ned's death, to Lee Batson, and they lived in the house until 1955. The mansion was too large, too haunted, too expensive. Lucy sold the majority of the original land to the Paul Truesdell Corporation, developers who created the prestigious Truesdell Estates. She then sold the remaining 18.3 acres, 18.3, including the mansion, to Henry Crown of Chicago for approximately $1.5 million. Crown never formally occupied the site, but leased it out as a filming location, a use that continues to this day. The city of Beverly Hills, concerned that Crown planned to demolish the mansion and subdivide the lot, purchased the property in 1965 for approximately $1.3 million. The city leased the mansion to the American Film Institute for $1 per year from 1965 to 1982, hoping the institute would pay for repairs and upkeep. The estate became a public park on September 16, 1971, and was added to the National Register of Historic Places on April 23, 1976. These steps were painful but practical. Preservation now required public ownership, reimagining the estate as a cultural asset rather than a private tragedy. A technical passage reveals how the city assessed and planned for the mansion's future. Engineering surveys identified foundation settling and structural issues. The conservators recommended stabilization techniques, including underpinning, reinforcement, and moisture control. The cost estimates included material and specialist labor and were presented as urgent. Filming revenues helped offset costs. Productions like There Will Be Blood contributed to renovations, including the restoration of the bowling alley. The summary reads in plain terms: public stewardship and selective commercial use would sustain the mansion for future generations. This technical decision illustrates the intersection of preservation, economics, and compromise. The narrative arcs toward a mixed conclusion in which tragedy and preservation coexist uneasily. Greystone did not collapse into ruin. It did not remain a private palace untouched by scandal. Instead, it became a public park, a filming location, and a teaching site. The house remained imposing, but the surrounding landscape and the terms of its use changed. Today, the site functions as a hybrid, a place of events and tours, an occasional film set, and a reminder of the darker side of California's golden age. It provides seasonal employment and, in its programs, attempts to tell not only the story of its builder, but the story of ambition, scandal, and mystery. The numbers are modest. The grounds are open daily from 10 a.m. to 5 or 6 p.m. depending on season. Admission and parking are free. The mansion interior is open periodically for tours. The estate hosts weddings, concerts, and cultural events that generate revenue. For maintenance, the city maintains the property and ensures its preservation as a historic landmark. The epilogue unfolds in 3 temporal moments to show immediate and long-term consequences. 1 month after the tragedy, a private funeral was held for Ned Doheny, attended by family and close associates. The mood was somber, the eulogies careful. Ned's eulogy spoke of a man in the full bloom of life, cut down too soon. Hugh's eulogy asked for mercy and understanding, noting that in a moment of fever and excitement he was not himself. The funerals were the last public acknowledgement of the tragedy before silence settled. 6 months later, the trials related to Teapot Dome continued. Albert Fall was convicted and sentenced to 1 year in prison. Edward Doheny Sr. was acquitted, but ordered to repay $47 million in settlements, taxes, and penalties. He was inundated by lawsuits from stockholders and became a reclusive invalid at his house on Chester Place for the last 3 years of his life. He died in 1935. His reputation never recovered. 5 years later, Lucy Doheny was still living at Greystone, raising her children with her new husband. The mansion had stabilized as a family home, but the shadow of the tragedy remained. The early fear that the house would become a public spectacle had receded, but the compromise remained imperfect. Some neighbors still whispered about the murders. Some family members mourned Ned and resented the silence that had been imposed. The epilogue shows that tragedy leaves scars that preservation cannot erase, and that legacy is negotiated across generations in ways that are never fully resolved. In conclusion, Greystone Mansion presents a lesson about wealth and cost. The house that read as timeless carried with it ongoing obligations that were fiscal, human, and moral. Its survival depended on choices that shifted its identity from private symbol to public responsibility. Numbers in ledgers and names in legal filings tell a story not only of architecture, but of ambition, scandal, and tragedy. Who paid the price? In truth, the cost was distributed. Workers paid with labor and risk. Hugh Plunkett paid with his life. Ned Doheny paid with his life. The family paid with reputation and privacy, and the public later paid with attention and stewardship. The Teapot Dome scandal destroyed Edward Doheny Sr.'s legacy. The mysterious deaths of Ned and Hugh ensured that Greystone would never be simply a house, but a monument to unanswered questions. Preservation in this case required public ownership, legal protections, and the willingness to tell a story that includes both beauty and darkness. If this investigation moved you, subscribe to the channel to follow more deep dives into houses where grandeur and consequence meet. Leave a comment with one word, scandal, death, or silence, to tell us which pressure you think most shaped Greystone. Thank you for listening. We will meet again to open another front door and to read its accounts of beauty and cost.